The heart monitor beside my hospital bed was the only sound in the room, and every beep of it was a countdown my wife had been waiting 4 years to hear. My name is Elijah Carrington. I was 56 years old, and 3 hours earlier, a cardiologist standing just outside my door had told a nurse he did not expect me to survive the week. He believed I was asleep. I was not. And when my wife Renata leaned over my bed that evening, smelling of champagne and peppermint gum, she did not whisper words of comfort to a dying man. She whispered a confession. She told me she had been poisoning me for months, that my $82 million would soon belong to her and to the man she loved, and that she was tired of pretending she had ever loved me at all. I kept my eyes almost closed. I let my breathing stay shallow. And in that moment, lying in a bed I was not supposed to walk away from, I made a decision that would turn her celebration into the start of a murder investigation. Before we continue further, beautiful people, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. I want to take you back to the beginning, because a story like this does not start in a hospital room. It starts years earlier, in a life that looked, from the outside, like exactly what a man works 30 years to build. I grew up in Detroit, in a house where money was tight, and my mother worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on. My father left when I was 9 years old, and I remember, even at that age, understanding that his absence had rearranged the entire shape of our household, that my mother's exhaustion had become the quiet, constant background of every single day that followed. I promised myself early, sitting at our kitchen table doing homework by the light of a single lamp, because we were careful about the electric bill, that I would build something that could never be taken from me by circumstance again. That promise shaped nearly every decision I made for the next 30 years. By the time I was 30, I had started a commercial furniture company out of a rented warehouse with 4 employees and a line of credit I was terrified to use. Terrified because I had watched my mother's fear of debt shape her entire life, and I had promised myself I would only take risks I could survive losing. Those first years were brutal in ways people rarely understand unless they have lived them. I slept in that warehouse more nights than I care to remember, wrapped in a blanket beside prototype chairs and desks, waking before dawn to meet delivery trucks myself because I could not yet afford a full receiving staff. By the time I was 50, that company supplied office furnishings to hospitals, universities, and government buildings across 6 states, and my name meant something in rooms I once could not have walked into without an appointment and a suit I had to borrow. I built an estate in Bethesda, Maryland, bought 2 condominiums as investment properties, and watched my portfolio grow past $80 million over the following years. I tell you all of this not to boast, but because you need to understand what was actually at stake in that hospital room, and why a woman like Renata would spend 4 years constructing a performance good enough to convince not just me, but everyone around us, including my own daughter, who called Renata a blessing at our wedding reception in front of 60 guests who believed exactly the same thing. I met Renata at a charity gala in Washington, D.C., the kind of event where everyone is dressed better than their actual bank account, and everyone is looking for something, though most people at those events would never admit that plainly, even to themselves. She was 40 years old when we met, 16 years younger than me, and she had a way of making a room feel smaller and warmer the moment she walked into it. A gift I have since come to understand was not accidental but deliberately cultivated over years of practice. She laughed at the right moments. She asked questions and actually seemed to listen to the answers, leaning slightly forward, tilting her head in a way that made you feel, even briefly, like the only person in a crowded room. My first wife, Rosalind, had passed away 8 years earlier after a long illness that had taken nearly 3 years to run its course, and I had convinced myself during those 8 years of grief that I was done looking for anyone, that I had already been given my one great love and did not deserve to ask for a second. Renata undid that conviction in a single conversation lasting perhaps 20 minutes, standing near a dessert table at a gala I almost did not attend. We married 18 months later in a small ceremony at my estate, and for the first 2 years, I believed I had been given a second chance at happiness I did not think I deserved. She organized my medication schedule, when my blood pressure first became a mild concern in my early 50s. She came to every doctor's appointment, sitting attentively, asking the physician follow-up questions I had not thought to ask myself. She told our friends, our family, and anyone who would listen that she could not imagine a single day of her life without me in it. And she said it, every single time, with a conviction that never once wavered enough to draw suspicion. I believed every word. The man standing beside her in that hospital confession was named Dominic Ashford, and he had been my private investment advisor for nearly 6 years before I understood what he actually was to my wife. Dominic managed a significant portion of my portfolio, sat beside me at 3 separate charity dinners a year, and called himself my closest friend outside of family, a claim I never once questioned because his actions, for 6 years, matched his words perfectly. He knew the names of my grandchildren and asked about them by name. He knew which bourbon I preferred and would have a bottle waiting whenever we met to discuss portfolio adjustments. He knew which meetings made me anxious and would arrive early to those specific meetings with a joke prepared, something small and thoughtful enough to ease the tension before we even sat down. I trusted him with decisions that moved millions of dollars, and I never once suspected that the trust I placed in him was being used to plan the exact year I would stop breathing. Looking back now, I can point to a dozen small moments that should have told me something was wrong. Moments that felt insignificant at the time and only revealed their true shape once I understood the full pattern behind them. The way Renata's phone would face down on the table the instant Dominic's name appeared on the screen. The way she would leave the room to take calls she said were from her sister, calls that always seemed to arrive at exactly the moments when a different explanation would have raised more questions than her sister's name ever did. The way my health began declining in a pattern doctors described as unusual, but never alarming enough, on its own, to trigger a deeper investigation. Unusual, I have learned since, is a word doctors use carefully, a word that acknowledges something does not quite fit the expected pattern without committing to the far more serious accusation that something has been done deliberately. It started with fatigue, small, explainable fatigue, the kind any man in his 50s running a company as demanding as mine might reasonably expect after a long stretch of travel and late nights. Then came the dizziness, mild at first, dismissed by my physician as a side effect of a new blood pressure medication we had recently adjusted. Then came the irregular heartbeat, the shortness of breath climbing a single flight of stairs I had climbed effortlessly for years, the nights I woke up drenched in sweat with my chest tight enough that I genuinely believed, for a moment, that I was dying right there in my own bed beside the woman I loved. Renata was there for every symptom, every single one, without exception. She drove me to every appointment, sitting in waiting rooms scrolling through articles on her phone about heart health, occasionally reading a paragraph aloud that seemed relevant to whatever we had just discussed with the doctor. She prepared a small dish of supplements and medication for me every single evening, measured out with what I believed, at the time, was love, was care, was the kind of quiet devotion I had once feared I would never find again after losing Rosalind. I did not know that dish was the mechanism of my decline. I did not know that every measured dose was calculated not to help my heart, but to wear it down slowly enough that no single test would ever catch it, gradually enough that when the end finally came, it would look like nothing more than a tired heart giving out after 56 hard years of building something from nothing. By the spring of that year, my condition had worsened to the point that I collapsed at my office in Detroit, in the middle of a supplier meeting, my vision narrowing at the edges before I lost consciousness entirely on the conference room floor. I was rushed first to a local hospital and then transferred, once stabilized, to St. Jude Memorial Hospital in Baltimore, closer to our estate and equipped with a cardiac specialist Renata insisted, at the time, was the best in the region. The cardiologist who examined me, a careful man named Dr. Patrick Osei, ran a full panel of tests over the following days and found damage to my heart that he described as inconsistent with my overall health history and my relatively active lifestyle. He used the word unusual more than once during our conversations. But unusual is not the same as suspicious, and in a system built to trust the people closest to a patient, no one thought to question the devoted wife bringing supplements from home every single evening, supplements she had researched carefully enough to speak about them fluently to any nurse who asked. 5 days, Dr. Osei told the nurse outside my door on a Tuesday morning in October, believing I could not hear him through the haze of medication still working through my system. Possibly less. His heart has sustained too much damage for us to reasonably expect otherwise. I heard every word of that conversation, lying perfectly still, my breathing shallow enough that no one in that hallway suspected I was awake at all. And an hour later, I heard my wife's version of that same sentence, delivered with a very different kind of relief. A relief so complete, it had actually made her smile before she remembered to check whether anyone was watching. I want you to sit with that moment for a second, because I have relived it more times than I can count in the years since it happened. A man lying in a hospital bed, weakened by months of poisoning he did not yet fully understand, hearing the woman he married promise to love him until the end, whisper instead that his death could not come fast enough to satisfy her. Renata did not cry that afternoon. She checked the hallway first, making certain no nurse was approaching before she spoke, and only then did her face change from the grief she had performed for the benefit of doctors and family members into something colder than I had ever seen on her in 4 years of marriage. She told me about the house near San Diego she and Dominic had already chosen, describing it with the same casual excitement she might have used to describe a vacation we were planning together. She told me she was exhausted from 4 years of pretending, exhausted in a tone that suggested the exhaustion itself was the injustice, rather than anything she had done to me. She told me, with a small, satisfied laugh that I have never been able to fully erase from my memory, that I had trusted her far too much, and that I should not waste my remaining strength trying to speak, because nothing I said now would change what was coming for either of us. A few minutes after Renata walked out of my room without looking back, the door opened again. I braced myself for her return. It was not her. A young hospital orderly stepped inside instead, adjusting the blanket at the foot of my bed, with the kind of careful attention most people in that building had stopped giving me days earlier. His name was Terrence Boyd. He was 25 years old, with dark circles under his eyes that told a story of their own, and a quiet kindness in his voice that did not feel rehearsed, the way so much of what I had heard from Renata over the previous 4 years had begun to feel in that single, devastating hour. "Would you like some water, Mr. Carrington?" he asked. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. Something in me needed to know, immediately, whether I could trust the next person who walked through that door. "Come closer," I said. He hesitated. Just slightly, enough that I noticed. "I need you to call someone," I told him. "If this involves hospital rules, I can ask the nurse." My attorney. His eyebrows lifted. This was not a request he heard often. "Please," I said again. He reached for the bedside phone. I stopped him with a small motion of my hand, weaker than I intended it to look. "Use your own phone," I said. That single request changed everything about the way he looked at me. He stepped back half a pace. "Sir, I don't do anything illegal," he said, and I could hear, underneath the words, a young man who had spent years protecting a spotless reputation because his family could not afford for him to lose it. "That is exactly why I chose you," I told him. I had learned pieces of Terrence's life from overheard conversations outside my room during the previous days, the kind of details that pass quietly between nurses when they think a patient is asleep or too medicated to follow along. He worked double shifts at St. Jude Memorial. Then, several nights a week, he drove across town and unloaded freight trucks until nearly dawn. His 14-year-old sister, Aaliyah, had been born with a severe congenital heart condition, one that required a highly specialized surgery his family could never afford on their own, no matter how many extra shifts he picked up. And still, in all the time I had watched him move through that hospital, he had never once cut a corner, never stolen so much as an extra pain pill, never treated the wealthy patients on that floor with more warmth than anyone else. He worked until his hands shook, because his sister needed him to, and because that was simply who he was. Renata had everything a person could reasonably ask for in this life, and she was willing to kill me for more of it. "Call Charles Whitmore," I said. "He's listed under legal counsel." Terrence found the number on my phone, still holding his own device uncertainly. "What should I tell him?" "Tell him I'm changing my estate plan. Tomorrow morning. Tell him it's urgent." He stared at me for a long beat. searching my face for signs of confusion, for the fog of heavy medication that might explain a request, this strange coming from a man doctors had given 5 days to live. "Mr. Carrington, are you sure you're thinking clearly?" I did not answer him in words. I unlocked my phone with trembling fingers and handed it to him instead, letting him scroll through company records, property deeds, investment statements, numbers large enough to make most people's hands shake, just holding the device that displayed them. I watched his expression shift. Disbelief first, then something closer to alarm. "I'm leaving control of my estate to an independent charitable trust," I told him. He exhaled, visibly relieved, as though the strangeness of the request had finally found a reasonable shape. Then I kept going. "You will serve as its first beneficiary advisor." He stepped backward, nearly bumping into the equipment tray behind him. "No," he said immediately. "I can't accept $82 million. "You're not," I said. "I'm preventing a murderer from receiving it." The color drained out of his face. "My wife confessed," I said, forcing the words out slowly, my chest tightening with the effort. "She's been poisoning me." For a moment, neither of us said anything at all. The heart monitor kept its steady, mechanical rhythm, the only sound left in the room. "We need to call the police," he said, already reaching for his own phone. "We will. Right now, Mr. Carrington. If Renata learns I hurt her," I said, "she will either destroy the evidence sitting in my own medicine cabinet tonight, or she will disappear with Dominic before sunrise, and I will die anyway, without a single piece of proof that any of this happened." Terrence shook his head slowly, the full weight of what I was asking finally landing. "You could die tonight either way." "I know." Those 2 words silenced him more completely than anything else I could have said. "I need 3 things," I told him. "My attorney, a toxicology specialist with no connection whatsoever to my wife or to Dominic Ashford's firm, and someone inside this hospital who can help me document everything happening around me without alerting a single person outside this room." Terrence glanced up at the small camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. "There's no audio recording in patient rooms," he said. "Just video, and it's not even monitored live on this floor." "Then we create evidence the right way," I said. "Legally, carefully, before she comes back tonight with that bottle in her handbag." He looked at me for a long moment, and I watched something settle into his expression, a decision forming behind his eyes that I would only fully understand the size of days later, once I learned exactly how much he was risking by choosing to help a stranger he had known for less than a week. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay, I'll call him." He stepped into the hallway to make the call, and I lay there alone in the dark, listening to the rain against the window, wondering whether the next 12 hours would be the last ones I ever experienced, and wondering, with a fear sharper than anything my failing heart had caused me, whether Renata would return before Charles Whitmore ever arrived. She did not know that I knew. She believed, walking back to that hotel bar to meet Dominic that evening, that she had hours left to celebrate before anyone found out anything at all. She had no idea the countdown had already reversed, and that it was no longer pointed at me. Charles Whitmore arrived at my hospital room at 11:40 that night, not the following morning as I had originally expected, because the moment Terrence explained what he had heard secondhand through my own trembling account, Charles understood there was no version of this situation that could safely wait until sunrise. He did not come dressed as an attorney. He came wearing scrubs borrowed from a friend who worked administration at a different hospital across the city, a small, calculated disguise designed to let him move through the halls of St. Jude Memorial without drawing the kind of attention a man in an expensive suit carrying a briefcase would have attracted at that hour. 22 years of trust had taught him exactly how fast I needed him to move, and exactly how quietly. He sat beside my bed in the dark, the only light coming from the hallway beneath the door and the pale glow of the monitor, and he listened to me describe every word Renata had whispered that evening, every detail, the champagne, the peppermint gum, the house near San Diego, the laugh. He did not interrupt me once. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and I watched his jaw tighten in a way I had never seen in 22 years of knowing him. "How long do we have before she comes back?" he asked. "She said the evening dose," I told him. "Tomorrow. Maybe sooner if something spooks her." "Then we don't have until morning," he said. we have tonight. He made 3 calls before 1 in the morning, each one careful, quiet, deliberate. The first was to a colleague who specialized in emergency estate law, someone he trusted enough to wake at midnight without a full explanation. The second was to a physician he had worked with years earlier on a capacity evaluation case, a man willing to come in off the books to confirm, on record, that I was mentally sound enough to make major legal decisions despite the medication in my system. The third call was the one that mattered most. Her name was Dr. Naomi Ellis, an independent toxicologist Charles had crossed paths with during a case nearly a decade earlier, a woman known throughout the region for 2 things: precision and absolute discretion. She answered on the second ring, already awake, and Charles later told me she asked exactly 4 questions before agreeing to drive to Baltimore that night. What is the suspected substance? How long has exposure likely occurred? Is the patient still receiving doses? And is the patient currently in danger? Charles told her yes to that last question, and she was in her car within 11 minutes. I want you to understand something about those hours, because they were some of the longest of my entire life, longer even than the moment Renata first leaned over my bed and told me the truth. I lay there in the dark, unable to sleep, unable to fully trust that Renata would not simply appear early, unannounced, carrying that same small bottle, and I found myself counting the seconds between each beep of the monitor beside me, the way a man counts anything when he has nothing left to control except his own attention. Terrence stayed with me most of that night, technically working, though I suspect he stretched his shift far beyond what his supervisor would have approved had anyone asked. He checked the hallway every 15 minutes. He kept his phone in his pocket, ready. At 2:17 in the morning, Dr. Ellis arrived, carrying a small case that looked, to anyone glancing at it, like nothing more than a standard medical kit. She introduced herself quietly, shook my hand with a grip firmer than I expected from someone who had just driven an hour and a half in the middle of the night for a stranger, and got to work almost immediately, drawing blood, collecting a sample of hair from the back of my head, labeling each vial and bag with a precision that told me, without her needing to say a single word, exactly how seriously she took what I had described to her over the phone through Charles. I won't have preliminary results until tomorrow afternoon at the earliest, she told me. But if what you're describing is accurate, we're looking at cumulative exposure, something dosed carefully, something meant to look like decline rather than an event. Will it be enough? I asked her. To prove it in a courtroom, if it comes to that? She looked at me directly, the kind of look that told me she understood exactly what I was really asking her. If she's been doing this for months, Dr. Ellis said, the levels in your system won't lie, even if she does. By 4 in the morning, the emergency estate documents had been drafted, printed, and reviewed twice by Charles's colleague over a video call from her home office. Her camera pointed carefully away from anything that might reveal she was working a case at that hour, without official clearance. The physician arrived shortly after 5 to begin the mental capacity evaluation, asking me the same careful, structured questions Charles had warned me would come. What year is it? Can you describe in general terms the assets you own? Why specifically do you want to change your estate plan on this particular morning, at this particular hour? I answered every question clearly, my voice weaker than I wanted it to be, but my mind sharper in that moment than it had felt in weeks, sharpened, I think, by the pure adrenaline of knowing exactly how much was riding on every word I said. The entire evaluation was recorded, start to finish, a small device propped discreetly on the rolling table beside my bed, because Charles knew, even in the chaos of that night, that the first thing Renata's future attorneys would claim was that a dying, medicated man could not possibly have understood what he was signing. He was not going to give them that opening. At 6:58 in the morning, with the sky outside my window just beginning to lighten from black to the deep gray of early dawn, Charles placed the final document in front of me and read the most important section aloud, slowly, making certain I understood every word before my signature made it permanent. The new estate plan removed Renata entirely as beneficiary. It froze every marital transfer that would normally activate upon my death. It placed Carrington commercial furniture and every property I owned inside a protected trust neither she nor Dominic could touch under any circumstance. It authorized an immediate forensic review of every account either of them had accessed in the past 2 years. And it contained the forfeiture clause Charles had drafted specifically for this exact situation. The clause stating that if evidence confirmed my illness had been caused intentionally by a beneficiary, that person would receive nothing, no matter what any prior agreement claimed. Once you sign this, Charles told me, there is no undoing it quietly. If Renata finds out before we're ready, she may run. Ashford may run with her. We may lose the chance to prove any of it. I understand, I said. And if the toxicology confirms what you believe, he continued, this document authorizes us to hand everything directly to the police. Immediately. No delay for you to reconsider. That's what I want, I told him. I picked up the pen. My hand shook badly enough that Charles reached out, briefly, to steady the clipboard beneath the page. Not to guide my hand, only to hold it still enough for my own signature to remain legible. Every stroke cost me more effort than it should have, but when I finished, the signature was unmistakably mine, clear enough to withstand any challenge anyone would ever bring against it. Terence witnessed it, standing quietly near the door. The physician witnessed it. The recorder captured every second of it, start to finish. Charles sealed the completed package into a folder and placed it into a locked case he had brought specifically for this purpose, and for the first time in nearly 9 hours, I watched him allow himself to exhale. It's done, he said. No matter what happens today, this is done. I did not feel relief, not yet. I felt something closer to the calm that comes right before a storm finally breaks. The strange stillness, in the last few seconds before you know, with absolute certainty, that everything is about to change. Renata was still asleep, most likely, somewhere across the city, still believing she had days left before anyone learned the truth. She did not know the sun rising outside my window that morning was rising on the last full day she would ever spend as a free woman. At exactly 10 o'clock that morning, a man in a white coat walked into my hospital room carrying a leather medical bag, and to anyone watching from the hallway, he looked like nothing more than a consulting physician making his rounds. It was Charles Whitmore again, this time properly dressed, the exhaustion of the previous night hidden carefully behind a clean shirt and a steady expression. Inside that bag was the second document, the one that was not a will or a trust agreement, but an authorization granting investigators full access to my home in Bethesda, including the medicine cabinet where Renata had been preparing my supplements every evening for months, the private security footage from our estate, and every financial account connected to either of our names. I signed it without hesitation, though I understood exactly what I was agreeing to. I was opening my own home, my own marriage, and every private corner of my life to strangers with badges and subpoenas, because the alternative was allowing a woman who had already tried to kill me once to try again with more patience the second time, and I was no longer willing to give her that chance. At that exact same hour, roughly 2 miles away, Renata was sitting at a hotel bar in downtown Baltimore, across from Dominic Ashford. Security footage recovered weeks later would show the two of them raising champagne glasses at 14 minutes past 10 in the morning, a celebration so confident, so entirely certain of its own success, that neither of them thought to lower their voices even slightly in a public space filled with other guests. Dominic leaned across the small table between them, and the footage later captured his lips clearly enough for investigators to read the question before audio confirmation matched it exactly. "How long?" he asked her. Renata smiled the smile I had fallen in love with 4 years earlier, the same smile she had used at our wedding, at every anniversary dinner, at every moment I had once believed was real. "By the weekend," she said. She believed in that moment that she was celebrating the final days of a marriage she had spent 4 years constructing, purely for the money waiting at the end of it. She had no idea that my blood was already sitting in an independent laboratory 2 miles away, being processed under a chain of custody strong enough to survive any courtroom challenge her future attorneys might attempt. She had no idea that every single account she and Dominic planned to empty the moment I died had already been frozen by a legal instrument she did not yet know existed. She raised her glass one more time that morning, and somewhere across the city, the countdown she believed was still counting down toward my death had already started counting down toward something else entirely. Over the following 2 days, while I remained in that hospital bed under close medical observation, Charles assembled a small team of forensic accountants he trusted completely, people who had worked with him on complicated cases before and understood the value of moving quietly. What they found, working through records that Dominic had spent nearly 2 years carefully arranging to look ordinary, was worse than any of us had initially suspected. Dominic had not simply been managing my investments during those 6 years. He had been slowly, methodically diverting funds from 3 separate accounts, restructuring transactions in ways designed to look like routine portfolio adjustments to anyone glancing at a monthly statement, and funneling a portion of that money into an offshore account connected to a shell company registered under a relative's name, a relative investigators would later determine had no actual knowledge his identity was being used at all. The amount, calculated across 18 months, exceeded $4 million. It was not enough money on any single transaction to raise immediate alarm. It was exactly enough money, repeated quietly and consistently enough, to prepare a comfortable escape for 2 people who believed they had all the time in the world to disappear once I was gone. I remember the moment Charles called me with the preliminary numbers, sitting in a small conference room at the hospital they had cleared for him to use privately, his voice careful in the way it always was, when he was about to tell me something he knew would hurt. "It's not just the poisoning," he said. "Dominic's been stealing from you for almost 2 years. Small amounts, consistent amounts. It adds up to just over $4 million. I closed my eyes. "Timed around what?" I asked, already suspecting the answer before he gave it. "Timed around your decline," Charles said quietly. "The transfers get larger during the exact weeks your symptoms were getting worse. It's like they were tracking you." I did not respond right away. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a person when they realize the full scope of a betrayal, larger than they had originally understood it to be, and I sat in that silence for a long moment before I finally spoke again. "Find everything," I told him. "Every dollar, every transfer. I don't want a single piece of this to remain hidden by the time this is over." Dr. Ellis's preliminary toxicology results arrived on the second day, in the late afternoon, and they confirmed exactly what I already knew from the words Renata herself had whispered beside my bed 2 nights earlier. My blood work showed repeated exposure to a cardiac medication at levels far exceeding my legitimate prescription, administered gradually enough over several months to mimic the slow, ordinary decline of a naturally weakening heart. It was, in Dr. Ellis's own words during her call with Charles, one of the more carefully paced poisoning cases she had encountered in her career, precise enough that had I actually died on schedule, there was a real possibility no autopsy would have ever flagged it as anything other than heart failure consistent with my age and medical history. I remember lying in that bed listening to those results over speakerphone and feeling something colder than fear settle into my chest. Not because I was surprised. I already knew the truth from Renata's own mouth. It was colder because hearing it confirmed by science, by cold, clinical numbers on a lab report, made it undeniable in a way that even her own confession had not quite accomplished. It stripped away any last, small hope I had been unconsciously holding on to, that perhaps I had misheard her, that perhaps exhaustion and medication had distorted what she actually said. The numbers did not lie. The numbers could not be explained away by grief or misunderstanding. Terrence Boyd remained by my side through most of those 2 days, working his regular hospital shifts and then quietly checking on me during breaks that were not technically his to take, risking the kind of scrutiny from his supervisors that could have easily cost him a job his family depended on. I asked him once, during a quiet moment in the late afternoon of the second day, why he was risking so much for a man he had known for less than a week. He was quiet for a moment before he answered. "My sister's been on a waiting list for surgery for almost 2 years, he said. Every specialist we talk to explains, real gentle, that money is what decides how fast a 14-year-old girl's heart gets fixed. You start to understand how the world actually works after you hear that enough times." He paused. "I didn't help you because you're rich, Mr. Carrington. I helped you because for once, the rich man in the room was the one getting wronged, and that felt like something worth standing next to." I told him, quietly, that his sister's surgery would be paid for in full, regardless of anything else that happened in that room. regardless of what happened to me in the days ahead. He shook his head immediately. I can't accept that. You're not accepting a gift, I told him. You're receiving exactly what any decent person deserves for choosing to do the right thing when doing the wrong thing would have been so much easier and so much safer for you. He did not argue further, though I could see, even then, that accepting help did not come naturally to him, that he had spent his entire life being the one who gave rather than the one who received. By the evening of the second day, Charles, Dr. Ellis, and two detectives from the Baltimore Police Department, Angela Ford and Samuel Okafor, had assembled everything they needed to move forward. Detective Ford, a 16-year veteran of the department's Financial Crimes Unit, reviewed the toxicology results, the forensic accounting trail connecting Dominic to the offshore transfers, and the legal documentation Charles had prepared, and both she and her partner agreed the evidence was strong enough to act. What remained was the final piece, the piece that would either confirm everything beyond any reasonable doubt or allow Renata one last chance to claim confusion and misunderstanding in front of a jury. They needed her to return to that hospital room one more time, believing nothing had changed, and administer what she believed would be another ordinary dose from the small bottle she had been carrying in her handbag for months. They needed me to refuse it, for the very first time since my hospitalization began, in front of witnesses who could testify to exactly what happened next. And they needed to be standing close enough, hidden just outside that door, to hear exactly what a woman says when a dying man, for the first time in months, simply says no. At 6:32 that evening, the door to my hospital room opened, and Renata walked in, carrying a small bouquet of white flowers, the kind of gesture she had perfected over 4 years of marriage, always just thoughtful enough to look sincere from a distance. She kissed my cheek gently and asked how I was feeling. I told her I was weak, and I meant it, because by that point I no longer had to work very hard to sound convincing. She smiled the way she always did before she was about to do something that mattered to her, and she told me to rest. Then she reached into her handbag and pulled out the small bottle I had come to recognize over the previous days as the instrument of my own slow death. "Your evening supplement will help," she said, her voice as soft and reassuring as it had been for 4 years. Terrence stood near the door, adjusting equipment that did not need adjusting, his hand pausing above the monitor exactly where we had rehearsed it earlier that afternoon. Every muscle in my body wanted to keep pretending, to swallow whatever she handed me the way I had done for months without ever questioning it once. I looked at the bottle in her hand. I looked at her face, the face I had once believed I would grow old beside. "No," I said. It was such a small word, and yet it landed in that room like something had physically shifted, like the air itself had changed shape around us. Renata froze completely, the bottle still extended toward me, her smile faltering for just a fraction of a second before she recovered it. "The doctor approved this," she said gently. "You know that." "Which doctor?" I asked her, keeping my voice as calm and steady as I could manage. "Specifically." Her expression changed. Only slightly. The way a person's face shifts when a script they have relied on for months suddenly, unexpectedly, stops working exactly as it always had before. And then she heard footsteps approaching from the hallway, more than one set, moving with purpose rather than the routine shuffle of hospital staff passing by. Her eyes flicked toward the door, and I watched something like instinct take over, a flicker of alarm crossing her face before she forced it back down. Charles Whitmore entered first, no longer disguised, dressed now as exactly what he was, my attorney, moving with the calm authority of a man who had spent the last 2 days preparing for this exact moment. Behind him came Dr. Ellis, and behind her, filling the doorway with a presence that left no room for confusion about what was happening, came Detective Angela Ford and Detective Samuel Okafor, both moving into the room with the deliberate, unhurried posture of people who had done this exact thing many times before and knew, from experience, that speed was not what this moment required. Renata slowly lowered the bottle, her eyes moving between the 4 of them and then back to me, searching my face for the confusion or weakness she had grown used to seeing there for months. She did not find it. She found something else instead: clarity, resolve, the face of a man who was no longer pretending to be too weak to fight back. Charles placed the signed authorization document on the small table beside my bed. "Your husband has revoked your medical authority," he told her, his voice flat, professional, the tone he reserved for moments that mattered most. "And he has removed you entirely from his estate plan." The flowers slipped out of her hand and landed on the tile floor, scattering white petals across the linoleum. "That's impossible," she said, her voice rising just slightly at the edges. "There has to be some kind of mistake." Detective Ford stepped forward, holding out a clear evidence bag. "Mrs. Carrington," she said calmly, "please place the bottle inside." Renata's hand trembled as she looked down at the small container, then back up at me, and I watched, for the first time in the 4 years I had known her, something on her face that looked genuinely like fear rather than performance. My phone rang at that exact moment, cutting through the tense silence of the room. Charles answered it on speaker, and the laboratory director's voice filled the space clearly enough for everyone present to hear. "The preliminary results," he said, "show repeated exposure to a cardiac medication at levels entirely inconsistent with the patient's actual prescription history." Detective Okafor turned his gaze toward Renata, and she took a small step backward toward the window, her back nearly pressed against the glass. "This is a misunderstanding," she said, her voice thinner now than it had been a moment earlier, the confidence that had carried her through 4 years of careful performance beginning to crack in real time in front of all of us. I opened my eyes fully then. No longer pretending to be the weakened, half-conscious man she believed she had been speaking to for the past 2 days. "You confessed beside my bed," I told her, my voice weak but no longer helpless, "because you believed a dying man could not answer you." She stared at me, and I watched her understand, in real time, exactly how badly she had miscalculated. Charles delivered the final piece then, the clause he had drafted specifically for a moment, exactly like this one. "Your husband's new estate plan," he told her, "contains a forfeiture provision. If his illness was caused intentionally by a beneficiary, or by anyone acting in coordination with that beneficiary, that person receives nothing at all." He closed the folder in his hands, and the sound of it closing seemed louder than it should have in that quiet room. Renata's celebration, the one that had begun with champagne at a hotel bar 2 mornings earlier, had lasted less than 48 hours. The money she believed she was hours away from inheriting was frozen entirely. The poison in my system was fully documented under a legal chain of custody, strong enough to withstand any courtroom challenge. And Dominic Ashford's name had already appeared on 3 separate suspicious transfers made from company accounts during the exact months my health had been declining under her care. Detective Ford asked Renata to sit down. Instead, she reached quickly for her phone on the small side table, her movements sharp and urgent, muscle memory alone perhaps still telling her that somehow, some way, this could still be fixed. A message flashed briefly across the screen before Detective Okafor gently took the phone out of her hand. It was from Dominic, sent less than a minute earlier. Did he sign anything? If he knows, leave the hospital now. Renata looked at that message, then at me, then at the 4 people standing between her and the door. And I watched the woman who had spent 4 years preparing my funeral finally understand something I had known for 2 full days already. I had not signed that document because I expected to die. I had signed it because I intended to make absolutely certain the truth survived me, regardless of what happened to my own body in the days that followed. Renata Carrington was arrested that evening on charges of attempted murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Taken out of my hospital room in handcuffs while nurses and a handful of other patients' family members watched quietly from the hallway, whispers already beginning to spread through the floor before she had even reached the elevator. Dominic Ashford was arrested less than 4 hours later, roughly 40 miles outside Baltimore, at a private airfield where investigators had tracked his phone the moment his message to Renata pinged off a nearby cell tower. He was found preparing to board a small chartered plane, a bag beside him containing over $200,000 in cash and 2 passports, each under a different name. Floodlights lit the tarmac as uniformed officers moved in from both sides of the runway, and witnesses later described Dominic's expression in that final moment as a man watching 6 years of careful, patient planning collapse in the span of a single phone call he had sent, trying to save the woman he loved, a call that instead confirmed everything investigators needed to close the case entirely. He did not resist. He simply stood there, hands raised, watching the plane he had believed would carry him toward a life he had spent nearly a decade building toward, one careful lie at a time. In the weeks following Renata and Dominic's arrests, while my own recovery began slowly at St. Jude Memorial, Charles assembled a full forensic accounting team to trace every account Dominic Ashford had ever managed, not just mine, going back across his entire career. It was tedious, painstaking work, the kind that rarely makes it into the dramatic parts of a story like this. Hours spent cross-referencing old client lists, dormant firm records, and financial filings buried in databases most people never think to search. But it was during that process that one of the junior accountants on Charles's team found something that stopped the entire investigation cold for nearly a full day. 9 years earlier, before Dominic ever managed a single dollar of mine, he had served as the financial advisor for a retired steel plant supervisor named Harold Chatham, living outside Columbus, Ohio. Harold was 71 years old at the time, a widower with no children close enough to visit more than a few times a year, and a modest but respectable retirement portfolio worth just under $3 million. Over the course of roughly 14 months under Dominic's management, Harold's health had begun declining, in a pattern his scattered family had dismissed, at the time, as the ordinary decline of a man in his 70s. He died in his sleep. His death certificate listed heart failure, consistent with his age, as the cause. No autopsy was ever performed, and Harold, according to his own wishes, was cremated within a week of his death. One of Harold's nieces, a woman named Diane Chatham Reyes, had raised concerns with local police at the time, describing how quickly her uncle's health had deteriorated and how unusually involved his financial advisor had become in his daily care during those final months, arriving with groceries, supplements, and what she described as an uncomfortable amount of personal attention for a man who was, on paper, simply managing Harold's investments. Local investigators looked into it briefly. They found nothing conclusive, largely because there was no toxicology available by the time anyone thought to request one, and the case was closed within a matter of weeks. Diane never stopped believing something had happened to her uncle. She simply had no way to prove it, and for 9 years, her uncle's case sat closed in a filing cabinet in a Columbus police department, unresolved, unremembered by anyone except a niece who could not let it go. When Detective Ford and Detective Okafor learned about Harold Chatham's name buried in Dominic's old client records, they immediately reached out to the Columbus Police Department and, eventually, to Diane Chatham Reyes herself. Charles later told me that when investigators explained what had happened to me, Diane wept on the phone, telling them she had waited 9 years for someone to finally believe her. 9 years of watching family members quietly suggest she had simply never accepted her uncle's natural death. 9 years of being told, gently but firmly, to let it go. The pattern, once laid beside my own case, was unmistakable to everyone involved. A wealthy or comfortably situated older person, isolated enough from close family that no one was watching too carefully. A financial advisor who slowly, patiently, became more involved in personal care than any advisor reasonably should. A gradual health decline explained away as the ordinary consequence of aging, and a death, or in my case a near death, that arrived close enough to the completion of a financial restructuring to suggest the timing was never coincidence at all. Because Harold Chatham had been cremated years earlier, prosecutors were never able to build a chargeable case against Dominic for his death specifically, and that failure remains, even now, one of the harder truths in this entire story. Some justice simply arrives too late to reach everyone it should have protected. But Diane's testimony, describing the pattern she had witnessed firsthand nearly a decade earlier, was ultimately allowed into my own trial as evidence of Dominic's history and intent, and I believe, even now, that it was one of the most powerful moments the jury heard during those 11 weeks of testimony that followed. The trial itself began on a cold morning in early spring, in a courtroom in downtown Baltimore that felt, on that first day, smaller than I expected a case of this size to require. I remember walking through the courthouse doors that morning with Charles beside me, Cameras from at least 3 local news stations gathered outside. My name and Renata's already appearing in headlines that described her, with a bluntness that still stung even though every word of it was true, as a woman who had married for $82 million and tried to collect early. Renata sat at the defense table in a plain gray suit, her hair pulled back simply, no jewelry, dressed by her attorneys, I understood later, specifically to look as unassuming as possible in front of a jury that had already read those same headlines before ever stepping foot in that courtroom. I sat in the gallery most days beside Charles, watching a woman I had once believed I would grow old with answer, through her attorney, to charges that could keep her in prison for the rest of her natural life. I will admit, there were mornings I did not want to be there. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from watching someone you loved be systematically, legally dismantled in front of strangers, even when you know, without any doubt, that they earned every moment of it. The prosecution built its case methodically over the first 4 weeks, beginning with Dr. Ellis, who walked the jury through the toxicology findings in careful clinical detail, explaining exactly how the cardiac medication found in my system had been administered gradually enough to avoid detection while still causing measurable cumulative damage to my heart over several months. She used charts. She used direct comparisons to my legitimate prescription history, showing precisely where the levels in my blood diverged from what any properly administered dosage would have produced. The defense attempted, during cross-examination, to suggest the elevated levels could have resulted from a pharmacy error or a mislabeled supplement, a theory their own expert witness presented with a confidence that briefly worried me as I watched from the gallery. Dr. Ellis dismantled that theory calmly and completely, explaining to the jury that a pharmacy error does not typically repeat itself in a consistent, escalating pattern across 5 separate months, timed specifically around the evening hours when Renata was known, by her own admission during the discovery process, to prepare my medication herself, alone, without any nurse or caregiver present to witness the process. I watched several jurors take notes during that exchange, their expressions shifting from cautious neutrality toward something closer to certainty. And I understood, watching them, that the defense's first real attempt at reasonable doubt had just quietly collapsed in front of everyone in that room. Terrence Boyd testified during the second week, and I remember watching him walk to the witness stand in a suit that looked slightly too formal for his frame, clearly borrowed or purchased specifically for this moment, and thinking about how far removed this courtroom must have felt from the freight trucks he unloaded overnight to help support his mother and sister. He described in plain, unpolished language that I believe landed harder with the jury than any polished testimony could have, exactly what he witnessed in my hospital room during those final days. The moment I asked him to call my attorney, the confession he had not personally heard, but that I had described to him immediately afterward, and the moment Renata offered me the bottle one final time while he stood near the door with his hand paused above the monitor. The defense attempted to characterize him as a young orderly manipulated by a wealthy patient into fabricating a story in exchange for financial reward, referencing, pointedly, the surgery I had since funded for his sister. Terrence answered that accusation without raising his voice even once, his composure remarkable for a young man who had never testified in a courtroom before in his life. My sister's surgery was offered to me after I chose to help Mr. Carrington, he told the courtroom, his voice steady. Not before. I would have made the same choice even if he'd never offered to help my family at all, because it was simply the right thing to do, and I'd like to think most people would agree with that, whether they're being paid for it or not. I watched 2 members of the jury nod almost imperceptibly at that answer, and I understood, in that moment, that whatever strategy the defense had planned around discrediting Terrence's motives had just failed as completely as their pharmacy error theory had failed a week earlier. The forensic accountants testified during the 3rd week, walking the jury through the $4 million Dominic had diverted from my accounts across 18 months, using visual charts that traced the money from my company's investment portfolio through a series of restructured transactions and eventually into an offshore account connected to the shell company registered under his cousin's name. A relative investigators had already confirmed had no actual knowledge his identity was being used and who was never charged in connection with the case. The defense's attempt to characterize these transfers as routine portfolio adjustments collapsed almost entirely once the accountants demonstrated, transaction by transaction, that the timing of each transfer correlated precisely with periods of decline in my health. Larger amounts moving during exactly the weeks my symptoms were worsening most significantly, as though Dominic and Renata had been tracking my decline like a countdown clock and adjusting their withdrawals accordingly, growing bolder as the calendar moved closer to what they believed would be my final days. By the end of that third week, watching the evidence accumulate day after day, I found myself thinking less about the verdict, which by that point felt almost inevitable, and more about the 4 years I had spent believing I understood the people closest to me. Every piece of testimony, every chart, every financial record entered into evidence peeled back another layer of a life I had lived without ever seeing its true shape. And I remember sitting in that gallery seat during the third week, watching Renata stare straight ahead at nothing in particular, and feeling, for the first time since the confession itself, something closer to sorrow than anger. Not for her, for the version of my own life I had genuinely believed I was living during those years, a version that had never actually existed at all. I testified during the fourth week of the trial, and it remains, even now, one of the hardest things I have ever done in my life. Charles had prepared me carefully for weeks beforehand, walking me through the exact sequence of events I would need to describe, warning me about the kinds of questions the defense would likely ask during cross-examination. But nothing he told me fully prepared me for what it actually felt like to sit in that witness box, 10 feet from Renata, and describe, in front of a room full of strangers, the exact words she had used to tell me she was killing me for money. I described the confession itself, word for word as I remembered it, the champagne and peppermint gum, the house near San Diego, the small laugh she gave before telling me I had trusted her far too much. My voice caught more than once. I did not try to hide it. Charles had told me, before I ever took the stand, not to perform strength I did not feel, that the jury would recognize genuine emotion far more easily than they would recognize a carefully rehearsed calm, and I believe now he was right. "Mr. Carrington," the prosecutor asked me, "can you describe what it felt like, in that moment, to hear your wife say those words to you?" I was quiet for a long moment before I answered. I had spent 4 years believing I'd been given a second chance at love I didn't think I deserved, I said. And in the span of about 90 seconds, I understood that every single day of those 4 years had been a performance built toward exactly this outcome. I don't know if there's a word for what that feels like. I've thought about it for months, and the closest I can get is that it felt like watching my entire life get rewritten in real time, by someone else, without my permission. The defense's cross-examination attempted to suggest my memory of that conversation had been distorted by heavy medication, that a man given 5 days to live could not reasonably be trusted to recall a conversation with the precision I had described it with. Their attorney, a sharp, composed woman named Rebecca Solis, pressed the point carefully. "Mr. Carrington, isn't it possible that in your medicated state you misheard your wife, or perhaps misremembered the exact wording of what was, at most, an unfortunate and cruel joke made in a moment of exhaustion?" I looked at her directly before answering. "A man does not forget the exact words the woman he loved used to tell him she was killing him for money," I said, regardless of what medication happens to be in his system at the time. I have relived that conversation every single night since it happened. I did not mishear a single word of it. I watched several members of the jury look away from Renata during that portion of my testimony, their expressions shifting in a way I recognized even from where I sat, and I understood, in that moment, that whatever chance her defense had of creating reasonable doubt around my testimony was disappearing with every word I spoke. Diane Chatham Reyes testified during the 5th week, flying in from Ohio for the first time in her life to sit in a courtroom nearly a decade after her uncle's death, still visibly emotional as she described the pattern she had witnessed with Harold nearly 10 years earlier. She spoke about the groceries Dominic used to bring, the supplements he insisted on managing personally, the way her uncle's health had declined steadily over 14 months in a pattern doctors at the time had called unremarkable for a man his age. She spoke about how no one had believed her when she raised concerns, how she had eventually stopped bringing it up at family gatherings because it made everyone uncomfortable. How she had carried, for 9 years, a quiet certainty that something had happened to her uncle that no one else was willing to investigate. "I used to think I was the only one who ever noticed," she told the courtroom, her voice breaking slightly. "I used to think maybe I was just grieving badly, looking for someone to blame, because natural death felt too random to accept. When the detectives called me and told me about Mr. Carrington's case, I felt something I hadn't felt in 9 years. I felt believed." The defense objected repeatedly to the relevance of a case that had never resulted in any charges against Dominic, arguing it was prejudicial and speculative, but the judge ultimately allowed her testimony as evidence of pattern and intent, ruling that a jury was entitled to understand this was not the first time such a method had been observed around Dominic Ashford's clients, even if it had never been formally proven in a court of law until now. Renata's own attorneys, in their closing arguments during the 6th week, attempted one final strategy, the only one, I believe, they had genuinely left available to them by that point. They argued that even if the jury believed Renata had spoken cruelly and inappropriately beside my hospital bed, cruelty alone was not the same as murder, and that no direct evidence proved Renata's own hands had administered the specific doses found in my blood work. They suggested, carefully, that Dominic alone could have been responsible for the poisoning, working without her full knowledge, and that Renata's confession beside my bed may have simply been a cruel, exhausted outburst rather than an admission of an actual crime she had committed herself. The prosecution's response was simple, and I believe, watching from the gallery, absolutely devastating in its simplicity. The lead prosecutor, a measured man named David Okonkwo, stood before the jury during his own closing argument and reminded them of exactly what had already been proven beyond any reasonable dispute. "Renata Carrington confessed," he told the jury, his voice calm but carrying easily across the courtroom. "Not to a detective, not under pressure. She confessed voluntarily, in her own words, beside her dying husband's bed, believing he would never live long enough to repeat what she said. We know the exact content of that confession because Mr. Carrington testified to it under oath, and his account has been corroborated, piece by piece, by every single element of physical and financial evidence presented to you over the past 6 weeks. The timing of the toxicology results, the timing of the financial transfers, the message sent from Dominic Ashford's own phone, in his own words, asking her whether her husband knew and telling her to run if he did. Ladies and gentlemen, a woman does not confess to poisoning her husband for money as a dark joke, moments after a cardiologist has given him 5 days to live. And she does not receive a text message telling her to flee the state within minutes of that confession being discovered, unless she understands, completely, exactly what she has done. The jury deliberated for just under 11 hours, across 2 days, before returning a verdict of guilty on all major charges against Renata, including attempted murder and conspiracy to commit murder. I was in the courtroom when the verdict was read, sitting beside Charles, my hands folded tightly in my lap, and I remember, even now, how strange the silence felt in that room, in the seconds before the foreperson spoke. An entire year of investigation, testimony, and grief compressed into a single held breath. Dominic Ashford, facing his own separate trial scheduled to begin only weeks later, chose instead to accept a plea agreement rather than risk a jury hearing the full weight of evidence connecting him to both my case and Harold Chatham's 9-year-old death. His attorneys, I later learned, advised him that the combination of the financial trail, the airfield arrest, and Diane Chatham Reyes's testimony left almost no realistic path toward acquittal, and that a plea agreement, however severe, represented his only remaining chance to avoid the maximum sentence a jury might otherwise hand down. He was sentenced to 18 years, with the forfeiture of every asset investigators could trace back to either scheme, including the $4 million diverted from my accounts and the $200,000 in cash recovered from the airfield. Renata was sentenced to 28 years, a number that felt, when I first heard it read aloud in that courtroom, both entirely justified and somehow still insufficient to fully capture what 4 years of calculated betrayal had actually cost me. I did not feel the relief I expected to feel when the verdicts were finally read. I felt instead something quieter and heavier, The understanding that no sentence, however long, could return the 4 years I had genuinely believed were the happiest of my life, or fully repair a heart that had been damaged slowly enough that even medicine could not undo all of what had been done to it. I walked out of that courthouse into an afternoon that felt strangely ordinary. Cars moving past on the street exactly as they had every other day of my life. And I remember thinking, standing on those courthouse steps beside Charles, that justice, when it finally arrives, rarely feels like the ending you imagined it would be while you were still fighting for it. Recovery, I learned in the months that followed the trial, is not a single moment where a doctor tells you that you are healed. It is a long, uneven stretch of time where some days feel like real progress and others feel like every ounce of poison Renata ever measured into that small dish is still sitting somewhere inside your chest, waiting to remind you it was real. Dr. Osei monitored my heart closely for the first 4 months after my release from St. Jude Memorial, adjusting my medication carefully, cautious never to repeat the exact routine that had once been used against me without my knowledge, checking and rechecking dosages with a thoroughness that felt, at times, almost like an apology on behalf of an entire medical system that had failed to catch what was happening to me for so many months. I remember the first time he told me my numbers were finally stabilizing. Sitting in his office on a gray morning in late winter, sunlight barely making it through heavy clouds outside his window. Instead of the relief I expected to feel, I felt something closer to grief, because stabilizing was not the same as returning to who I had been before any of this started. My heart would carry the damage of those months for the rest of my life, a permanent reminder etched into the muscle itself of exactly how far someone I loved had been willing to go for money I had already been prepared to share with her honestly, had she simply asked me instead of choosing to take it the way she did. The physical recovery, difficult as it was, felt almost simple compared to what came after it. I found myself, in the months following the trial, unable to fully trust rooms I had once felt completely safe in. My own kitchen, where Renata had prepared that small dish of supplements nearly every evening for months, became a space I avoided entirely for weeks after returning home, until I finally had it fully renovated, not out of any real belief that a poisoned kitchen could somehow still hold danger, but because I needed to physically change the space in order to walk through it without my chest tightening involuntarily every single time. I found myself checking medication bottles twice, sometimes 3 times, before taking anything. Even vitamins I had purchased myself from a pharmacy I trusted completely, my hands sometimes trembling slightly as I read and reread the labels, searching for a discrepancy I knew, logically, would not be there. Charles once told me, gently, over coffee at my kitchen table roughly 8 months after the trial concluded, that what I was experiencing had a name, that trauma reshapes the body's instincts long after the actual danger has passed, and that healing from betrayal at this scale was not something any of us should expect to move through quickly, no matter how strong a person believed themselves to be going into it. I want to tell you honestly that I considered, more than once during those early months, simply disappearing from public life entirely. I had the resources to do it, more than enough to live out the rest of my years quietly, anonymously, somewhere no one knew my name or the headlines that had followed it across every local news station and eventually several national outlets as well. What stopped me, more than anything else, was a conversation I had with Terrence Boyd roughly 6 weeks after the trial concluded. A conversation that started as something simple and drifted, as honest conversations sometimes do, into something far more important than either of us expected when we first sat down. I had asked him to meet me for coffee, ostensibly to discuss the final arrangements for his sister's surgery, but somewhere between our first cup and our second, I found myself asking him something I had been carrying quietly for weeks. I asked him how he managed to keep working double shifts and unloading freight trucks overnight for years without ever once cutting a corner or accepting an easier path, even when an easier path was clearly, repeatedly available to him. He was quiet for a moment, turning his cup slowly on the table between us. My grandmother used to tell me, giving up on doing things the right way is a decision, he said finally, not a circumstance. She said the moment you let circumstance make that decision for you, you stop being the kind of person capable of recognizing right from wrong when it actually matters most. He looked up at me. I think you're thinking about disappearing, Mr. Carrington. I think you should sit with what that would actually mean before you do it. I did sit with it. And I realized, over the following days, that disappearing quietly would have been its own kind of surrender. One final victory Renata and Dominic did not deserve. A satisfaction I was not willing to hand either of them, even from behind prison walls they would now spend decades looking at, instead of the ocean views they had once planned for near San Diego. Elijah Boyd's surgery took place 3 months after Renata's arrest, at a children's cardiac center in Baltimore, with a surgical team Dr. Osei personally helped identify as among the best in the region for her specific condition. I was not in the operating room, obviously, but I sat in the waiting room that day alongside Terrence and his mother, a quiet, deeply kind woman named Vanessa Boyd, who thanked me so many times during those 8 hours that I eventually had to ask her gently to stop, because the gratitude, sincere as it clearly was, had begun to feel like more weight than I quite knew how to carry, especially given everything her son had already risked for me without asking for anything in return. The surgery lasted just over 7 hours, each one longer than the last, as the afternoon wore into evening, the three of us taking turns pacing the small waiting area, refilling coffee we barely drank, checking the clock more often than any of us admitted to each other. When the surgeon finally emerged, still in scrubs, to tell us it had gone well, better than well, that Aaliyah's repaired heart was already showing strong, healthy rhythm on the monitor, I watched Terrence Boyd, a young man I had seen remain composed through hospital confrontations, courtroom testimony, and months of quiet, dangerous risk on my behalf, finally allow himself to cry in a hospital waiting room, his mother's arms wrapped tightly around him, the two of them holding each other in a way that made the entire room go quiet out of respect. I established the Elijah Boyd Medical Trust roughly 6 months later, though Terrence objected to the name from the moment I first proposed it, insisting his sister would be embarrassed to have a foundation carrying her name attached to a story that began with someone else's near murder rather than her own recovery. Let people know her name because of something good, I told him, not because of what almost happened to me. That's the whole point. I told him honestly that the foundation existed because of his sister's story, not mine, and that her surgery had shown me exactly the kind of gap in this country's healthcare system that families like his fall into every single day. Families who work themselves to exhaustion, doing everything right, and still cannot access the care their children need without a stranger's intervention arriving, essentially, by chance. The trust now funds cardiac surgeries and long-term care for children from working families across Maryland and parts of Ohio, the Ohio Connection Deliberate, a decision I made after learning about Harold Chatham and Diane Chatham Reyes, wanting some small piece of good to come out of a state that had, for 9 years, carried an injustice no one had been able to prove or repair. Terrence now serves as the foundation's beneficiary advisor, a role I insisted on despite his repeated objections, because I have never met anyone better equipped to identify which families genuinely need help and which applications, unfortunately, are not entirely what they claim to be. He reviews cases with the same quiet, careful attention he once brought to a stranger's hospital room, and I have watched him turn down applications from families with connections or influence in favor of families with none at all, simply because the need in front of him was greater and more honest. Aaliyah herself, now 17 and healthier than I imagine she has ever been in her entire life, visits my estate several times a year, usually alongside her brother and mother, and I have watched her grow from a frail teenager who spent most of her early adolescence in and out of hospital beds into a young woman with a sharpness of mind that genuinely humbles me every time we speak. She has told me, more than once, that she wants to become a pediatric cardiac nurse, that she wants to be the kind of presence in a hospital room that Terrence was for me, someone who notices what others overlook and chooses to act on it even when acting is not required of them by any job description. I believe, without any hesitation, that she will become exactly that kind of nurse, and I have already told her that whatever education she needs to get there, the foundation, and I personally, will make certain nothing stands in her way, the same way nothing stood in her way once the surgery she needed finally arrived on time instead of years too late.